Hello, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Center for Brooklyn History. My name is Marcia Eli, and I have the joy of greeting you on behalf of the Brooklyn Public Library, which we are part of, all of my colleagues at the center, and the Arts and Culture team, BPL Presents. It feels especially resonant that tonight's program about the future of New York City's landmarks takes place here in the Center for Brooklyn History's exquisite 1881 landmark building designed by George B. Post. Post's design for the reading room, which is directly above us, was a breakthrough innovation for its time, a double high ceiling with a truss system and a mezzanine. Many people visit the building to see this interior landmark. The room is also the face of the Center for Brooklyn History's extensive archives, the largest collection of Brooklyn-related materials in the world. Day-to-day, researchers, scholars, middle school students, homeowners curious about their properties, and many others all come to connect with the special collections within. And the number one request by these patrons is for building research. Tonight's program is titled, What to Save? Landmarks for a New New York. What to save is a short question, but hardly a simple one. That question inspired a new book of essays commissioned by legendary preservationist Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel, titled Beyond Architecture, The New New York, which commemorates the 60th anniversary of the 1965 New York Landmarks Law. We're honored to have two of the book's distinguished essayists tonight, along with our esteemed moderator, to explore that question as we look towards the next 60 years. Beyond Architecture is available at the CBH shop. You might have seen it as you came in. I hope you'll flip through it and consider taking a copy home. I know that our guests tonight would be happy to sign. I also want to share that you will have a chance to ask your questions of our panel towards the end of the program tonight. Our ushers will bring the mic to you in the audience, and I only ask that you please keep your questions short and delete the personal commentary. Now it's my great pleasure to say a few brief words about tonight's guests. Honestly, we would be here all night if I listed all of their accomplishments, so you can fill it all in. There's so much, and we're so thrilled and delighted to host them all. Vishaan Chakrabarti has over 30 years of experience investigating, designing, and implementing urban architecture, and is the founder and creative director of Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, PAW, where he leads the firm's growing global portfolio of cultural, institutional, and public projects. He also served as the Thomas J. Baird Visiting Critic Architecture at Cornell College of Architecture Art Planning. Chakrabarti's past roles include, but aren't limited to, the principal at architecture firms Shop Architects and Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, president of the Moynihan Station Venture at the related companies, director of the Manhattan office for the New York Department of City Planning in the Bloomberg administration, and the William W. Worcester Dean of the College of Environmental Design at UC Berkeley. Lisa Switkin is a design leader and partner at Field Operations, a leading-edge landscape architecture and urban design practice. With a background in urban planning and landscape architecture, Lisa focuses on improving cities through the design of a resilient, holistic, and vibrant public realm inspired by place, people, and nature. She has been intimately involved in numerous important multidisciplinary projects, including but not limited to, the High Line, Domino Park, Santa Monica's Tongva Park, Gansevoort Peninsula and Hudson River Park, the 1.5-mile-long river balcony in St. Paul, the master plans for Staten Island's Freshkill Parks, and most recently, Cleveland's North Coast Master Plan. She's past president of the Landscape Architecture Foundation and currently serves on the board of directors for the Urban Design Forum. And finally, our moderator tonight, Jorge Otero-Pailos, Jorge is a Spanish-American artist, preservation architect, scholar, and educator renowned for pioneering experimental preservation practices. Alongside his artistic practice, he serves as director and professor of historic preservation at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, where he also directs the Columbia Preservation Technology Lab and founded the first PhD program in historic preservation in the United States. He's a licensed architect who studied architecture at Cornell and earned a doctorate in architecture from MIT, and his artworks have been commissioned by and exhibited at major heritage sites, museums, foundations, biennials, including the Chicago Architectural Biennial, Art Angels Public Art Commission at the UK Parliament, and the Victoria and Albert Museum, among others. So there's so much more to say, but I think you want to hear from them. Please help me welcome Vishaan, Lisa, and Jorge.
Okay, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for the kind introduction, Marcia. Thank you all for being here tonight. It's, I think, only in Brooklyn that you get such an amazing crowd for a preservation lecture. So, of course, it's so great to be in Brooklyn because Brooklyn had so much to contribute to the passing 60 years ago of the Landmarks Preservation Law. And, of course, there's a plaque on the front of this building that reminds us that the Brooklyn Heights Historic District was the first in New York City. So, you know, there's a lot to be proud of over here. And we're here to discuss not only the last 60 years of the law, but also the next 60 years, the future of preservation with Vishaan and Lisa, who've been thinking about and also doing so much to advance the concept of preservation in New York and globally, in fact. The book is amazing. Barbaralee Diamonstein-Spielvogel is a powerhouse of preservation. If you don't have this book, you should not leave here tonight without buying a copy. There is so much richness in this book and so many different points of view about the future of preservation that it's really worth a read. I want to start our conversation by addressing the title of the book. It says, Beyond Architecture. And of course, the Landmarks Law was all about protecting architecture. And so there is a kind of polemic already set up in the book to say that there's something wanting in the law. There's something that the law didn't capture by focusing on architecture and, of course, historic districts, which are collections of architectural, buildings. Now, in order to do that, I thought I would ask you both to talk about a building architecture. Can we call it architecture? The Domino Sugar Factory, which you both collaborated on. But in fact, in some ways, this project exemplifies the idea that it is a lot more than architecture. And Lisa, I thought I would start with you to ask you about the process of thinking, because you, of course, worked on the whole landscape. It's a waterfront property. What is it about this that, for you, goes beyond our traditional understanding of architecture?
Sure. I mean, in many ways, I think the whole project is really about the site. We were just talking about this, and its relationship to the river, its relationship to the neighborhood, or its lack of a relationship actually to the neighborhood for 160 years before it was reopened, and creating those stronger connections, and also its relationship to a larger network of waterfront spaces all along Williamsburg and Greenpoint. And so in many ways, the redevelopment started first, but I like to sometimes refer to as like inside-out planning. you sort of start with everything but the buildings and you make those connections, and you think about the open space and the public spaces, and then you go in and figure out how to best kind of work with and place the buildings. And then, of course, the centerpiece and the sort of geographical and symbolic heart is the Landmark Refinery building itself, which sits right at the center. And that was reimagined, from the beginning as something more than just the facade.
Often when we think about more than just architecture, we think about the people. Of course, Brooklyn has a very strong community. How did you engage with that community?
Well, I think the way that we like to think about this project in particular, so there's the formal process, which you have to go through to do the uniform landmark review process, right? And that does require community boards and meetings and public. But then there's like a whole series of the more informal process. And we were lucky to have the client of Two Trees because they really wanted to engage and work with community leaders and figure out how to bring them not only to influence the design and the park and the usability of it and what they most sort of wanted to do and see there, but also in its kind of afterlife and all of the programming and the sort of employment training and sort of becoming the sort of life of the park today. So it was kind of a full life cycle, from the beginning and after. And I think that was really important. It wasn't about thinking about a new community from scratch, even though there is a lot of new residential, commercial development, et cetera. It was about how to kind of make sure it was rooted in that place and that it first and foremost served that community and the ones beyond.
Vishaan, let me turn it over to you. This has become such a signature of the waterfront, architecturally, of course. I don't know an architect yet that doesn't like it.
That by itself is extraordinary. Yeah.
But maybe you do. I don't know. I mean, I certainly don't.
Name one.
How could it be that we can both love this as an architectural proposition and be more than architecture? What do you see here that it goes beyond architecture in this project?
Yeah, great question, and thanks for having us. And just a thanks to Barbaralee for bringing us all together, because the working on this project was a great act of love. So I've had the privilege of working with Lisa on untold number of projects at this point. We worked together in the High Line in the early days, and on Domino. So I was a partner at Shop Architects. This was now 15 years ago when we started the master plan, and it was, for those of you in the profession, sometimes architects and landscape architects, they squabble. We never squabble. It was a dream collaboration, I felt like, from the beginning. We respected each other. We had very similar urban ideas about how the neighborhood could reintegrate into the site. And Lisa's right. The site drives everything. The Domino Sugar Refinery is there because it was deeply connected to the slave trade, because it was one of the deepest parts of the river. Sugarcane would come up from the Caribbean and get processed there. And so the site kind of tells a story by itself. And then when I started POW about 5 years later, Two Trees, Jed Walentis called me and said, it's time to tackle the refinery. And even there was a great collaboration, because it is not just a piece of architecture. The building itself is also a piece of landscape architecture, because the key architectural move in the building was to create a gap between the old building and the new building. The original building was built in 3 phases. None of the windows lined up, so you couldn't strike a floor across it that was straight. Big issue for a wheelchair, for instance, if you had to navigate a lot of changes. It's a landmark, and so you couldn't get a lot of light through the very small windows. And as Jed Walentis was describing this to me, I said, I literally drew this thing on a piece of paper and said, Jed, you've got to build a building inside a building to bring in light through this gap, and that'll make the building much easier to build. And Justin Davidson famously later called this a bottle in a ship. But then it was really Lisa's genius that brought this idea of planting pin oak trees in that gap and creating this extraordinary world of biophilia in that gap. And I think in a way it predicted the post-pandemic circumstance of what kind of place does a creative worker want to be in, that isn't kind of your just flat glass office building. But I want to get finally just to the core of your question about, it is interesting to me, the response. The response has been genuinely gratifying, not just from the design community, but from the community and from New Yorkers more generally. And the last time I felt like there was that kind of response on something I'd ever worked on, it was actually the High Line. And I think the two share something extraordinary that goes well beyond architecture. They are, for New Yorkers, I think, big muscular reminders of our history, but also they were both transformed into some future use, right? And so to me, what I love about that in terms of this conversation is the idea that preservation is an act of evolution, right? And it is not this binary of, preservationists versus developers and change versus freezing things in amber, but actually understanding things more as a continuum. And I really believe that if in the 20th century we tore things down and just replaced them whole cloth, then this century we've learned more about how to create this sense of palimpsest of layering history and pulling the past forward into the future. And I think that is why it has captured people's hearts and minds, because it's trying to live in that liminal kind of dialectic.
Let's explore this notion of the palimpsest as a model for how to think about New York City. A city that has often torn down buildings in order to build new ones. Here's an example of one in which you've used the existing building as a catalyst for something new. You mentioned the High Line. Can you talk a little bit about how the High Line is a palimpsest? How do you see that as a palimpsest?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I was actually thinking about, people always ask the question of why was field operations selected, do you think, for this design? And I kind of went back and thought about the work that the whole office contributed. And right at the very beginning, we actually positioned ourselves somewhere in between, purposefully, total preservation and total transformation. And that was not only a strategic positioning, but it was a statement about this balance of past and future and of finding the essence of place, and that actually bringing power and materiality and specificity and then transforming it. And I think that did, it struck a chord with people. It was something that was grown. It was like something new that was grown out of something old. And I think that metaphor, that balance, is really important. And people do it in many different ways and strike that balance in different ways. But I think that project and Domino, had a really careful and thoughtful way to think about how to balance those two things, what to keep, and what to transform.
And the magic, though, because when you went up on the High Line before all the work, there was a kind of magic of being somewhere.
Yeah, we always said our biggest goal was not to screw it up.
Not to screw that feeling, right?
Yeah.
The idea of the palimpsest that you both have been working with contrasts quite radically with the 20th century idea of development as a tabula rasa. Can you nuance that a little bit? I mean, where do you see the profession, and I'll turn this to you, Vishaan, where do you see the profession of architecture going? A profession that has invested so much in this idea that, newer is better.
So, first of all, I consider myself an urbanist before I consider myself an architect. I love architecture. I love being a practicing architect. But to me, cities are one of the great things that we've invented as a species. And, the pandemic sort of proved that once we have technology that could let at least a majority of us work remotely, we still do this. Right? We still do this. We still gather in physical space. How many of you really want to listen to the three of us on Zoom? Right? Really. Right? And so we still do this. And so to me, fundamentally, cities are about people and cities are about acts of accretion. All great cities, Daniel Patrick Moynihan famously said, if you want a great city, build a university and wait 200 years, right? interesting in today's context. So this idea that you adaptively reuse things, we are so used to talking about adaptive reuse in terms of buildings. I think of it much more broadly. I think of it as adaptively reusing the city. Part of why I'm a proponent of this city becoming, we're about 8.4 million people. I think we should be a city of over 10 million people, because we're adaptively reusing extraordinary legacy infrastructure that our predecessors left us. A subway system, one of the only subway systems in the world that has both local and express tracks. Water systems, roadway systems, park systems. And the more we understand that that's a place of evolution, the more we will double down on what makes our cities great and what makes the people in them great, and what actually provides a bulwark against the kind of extremes of national government that we've seen throughout history, right? I mean, Berlin famously was a kind of place of revolution, in the 1930s, right? And so, it's very important, this idea of the culture of cities. And so the last thing I just say about that is that, especially in the preservation community, it's so important to have this dialogue, right? Because if the title of today's talk is "What Should We Save?" I hope what we save is New York's spirit of constant evolution.
Sure. I mean, that's a hard thing to follow, that last statement. But I was just going to say, I mean, the concept of going back to the palimpsest, I mean, the concept of tabula rasa is almost non-existent in landscape systems and theories. Like, we don't ever, as trained as a landscape architect, you never think about a space being void of history or stories, narratives that are cultural, natural, et cetera. Like places is there, right? Whether it's revealed or not. So I think for us, it's drawing out. Sometimes it's uncovering, recovering, revealing. Sometimes it's an act of actually removal versus adding. But there is no such thing as tabula rasa, because everything is grown from something else. And the whole, I actually did a minor when I was in college in archaeology. It's a similar, which I know your piece specifically sort of talked about, but the idea of like the tell, or like, cities built upon cities, built upon cities, built upon cities over time, because they were, cited for their water, for their routes, for their this, for their that, right? And it is a buildup over time, and places were reborn, consistently over time. And it's the same thing with any piece. It's been there, any place has been here long before we humans were here, and will exist probably long after we leave.
Can I just build on one thing that Lisa just said, and it goes back to your question? I totally agree. Every landscape architect I know never deals with land as tabula rasa in a way that I do think many architects did. I sense a generational break occurring in our profession, in the profession of architecture. So there are going to be folks who love to run off to the Saudi Arabian desert and build spaceships built, in the sand with slaves, right? And that is that impulse for tabula rasa, even though the desert is not tabula rasa, but that impulse to like build your object building without any bureaucracy, without anyone interfering. I'm the eldest part of Gen X, but like I still sense this very significant tectonic shift happening in the field with the people I consider my colleagues in this, who are really thinking much more of architecture as an archaeological act, right? And right about that. But I just wanted to kind of double down on what Lisa was saying.
Well, it's interesting, that we're trained to see the world according to a certain lens. And as architects, certainly the training was that you recognize architecture. And if it's land, you don't know how to read it. So the dialogue that you've both had, where you've brought your disciplinary points of view as an urbanist, as a landscape architect, to recognize what is there, in ways that, let's say, if you were just operating within one discipline or another, you might miss some things. Because, of course, we've learned to look at land as inhabited, even though there might not be any buildings there. But it's taken us a while, and this is, I think,
And
maybe the
sometimes
generational.
it's more even conceptual. I mean, sometimes it's not always physical. It's about, like, even at Domino, something like the views and the vista, or about, you know, a kind of reading of the place, the opening up of the place, the sort of slowness, or the way it's insulated, or there are other things that kind of contribute to, I think, evoking history that aren't always about, sometimes it is about a very particular material or, you know, very particular site, but sometimes it's not. It's about these larger concepts. And I think many times we in our office like think about what is the essence of place. And of course, even that is an act. You're sort of deciding, and someone else would think that it's something else. But, you know, you do try to kind of draw that out in many ways and even amplify it.
And some of the histories that you uncover are not pleasant. I mean, you mentioned there was a history of slavery. I remember Kara Walker's installation there, addressing some of those themes. I imagine there would have been, was it a brownfield site? There was a toxic history, like literally pollution on the land?
There were a few hot spots, but
So how do you engage with those difficult histories without brushing them away?
I mean, it's a really good question, and I think that every project or site has a different response to that. But here, I mean, at Domino, there was a bit of course, kind of unearthing some of the machinery and the cranes and the things that were part of the working, the sort of innards of the refinery building, and bringing them, kind of viewing them in a different way. But part of that was not only because it's powerful as a physical thing, but it is to sort of inspire curiosity, where people are starting to think about what was this site and what did it do. And I think we many times try to think of things that actually spark this sense of curiosity, and that people then ask questions, and then they go and they find
Give
answers.
us an example of that in that site. What did you do that specifically ground people in the place?
So, I mean, I think even, so the cranes, which were actually on the bulkhead originally, we did set them back a bit, but we kept them, we refurbished them. They were painted, actually, people ask about the color, but that is Domino blue. It was actually found throughout the factory, that sort of kind of robin's egg kind of blue. And, you know, but at the same time, we brought people in really close contact to them. So there's a kind of slow way to walk up to them, and there's a catwalk that is actually suspended on the existing raw sugar warehouse columns. And so you sort of, you're positioned and you have this different relationship to that structure. And therefore, I think it starts to make you think about what was there and why.
Did you put a plaque as well?
There's, no, not really. I mean, and this is actually a really good question because there's a lot of discourse around, you know, plaques versus not plaques versus, you know, interpretations and et cetera. But there is it's not a plaque per se, but there's a sign at the base of the cranes that talk about the dedication to the workers and this, that, and talks a little bit about the history of the sugar factory, which actually had like multiple strikes because of terrible work conditions. And so it does kind of unearth some of that history as well.
You know, I think there's a question of whether something wants to be didactic or emotive. I think both in Lisa's landscape work at Domino and our architecture, it tends more to the emotive than the didactic, in the sense that what the entire site is filled with, certainly what the building is filled with, is the patina and the scarring of the industrial history of the place. So one of the things we were very careful about with the sugar refinery was brick was only repointed where it was structurally necessary. So, you know, it's a landmark, but it's not the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It was a factory that was used in this very, very, you know, industrious way. They pulled things out, they tore out brick, they did all this. They did not treat this building gingerly. And then the new building that sits in, one of the best conversations we had with the Landmarks Commission was the fact that, most of the facade is actually an illusion. It was fenestration that was not representing floor plates behind it. There were big vats that were, so there was a whole steel tieback system that held up the brick facade. So when the new building went in, and it was this nesting of the new building inside the old building, we remade that steel tieback system as an echo of the original condition. And so there's this, and to me, this is the palimpsest nature of it. There's no way the entire project could be anywhere else. And in an era of urban growth, I think this is fundamentally important that you have, there's a lot of change that's happened on that site, but it cannot be anywhere else because of the grounding to that emotive past. Whereas I think there's another project I'm working on that has to do with the Underground Railroad, where the elements have to be quite didactic to be successful in terms of people understanding what it is. And so I think, even the history and the tie to slavery, which the Kara Walker channeled so well, I don't think it was as much our charge. We went to, hundreds of community meetings. And the thing that I think we really heard from people was they wanted to embody the industrial waterfront past of Brooklyn, which is, I think, what you feel when you're on that site. So it's also sort of whose history and why.
Well, and there was also, I think, because so many people had been cut off from the waterfront for so long, even though their grandparents or whoever worked at the factories, there was this real embrace that, no, this is going to have a new life, and that's what matters to us. But it's interesting, so in the essay that I wrote, I actually, of course, I cited certain projects and things, but I approached it, I actually didn't talk about the work, which is hard to do from a practitioner's point of view. I was starting to think about what does the concept of beyond architecture, and specifically how does the Landmarks Law consider or not consider public realm and public space?
Well, let's turn to that. And let's talk about the law. So, this is a book that celebrates the law. You both engaged with the law. The law is a form of regulation. I was thinking historically is so interesting because the United States tends to approach kind of innovation in terms of leave it unregulated for as long as possible. And then, you look at, for example, the cities, right? Unregulated until you get the 1916, the zoning ordinance is quite late. And then
I'm still shocked to work in cities where they're we don't really have zoning.
right.
Yeah, they have much less of a housing crisis, by the way.
And of course, then we have the Landmarks Law in 65. And there are updates to these laws. There's, 1961, the zoning ordinance gets updated. And there is an update in 73, 74 to the Landmarks Law to include scenic landmarks, which is what you engage with in your essay. So tell us a little bit about that idea. There are very few scenic landmarks. You're critical of the idea. Yeah. You both like it, but you're also critical tell us about how that idea of the scenic landmark relates to your notion of the public realm.
Yeah, I struggled with this a bit, sort of thinking about this concept. So there are only 12 scenic landmarks, of which I can't remember, but let's say over half are Frederick Law Olmsted landmarks or designed sites. So it's just very limiting. And I think even the word and the connotations around what is a scenic landmark is limiting. And so I was trying to argue that public space and public realm is so critical to how we experience the city. It's literally how we move through and experience the city when we're not at home or at work or in a building. That needed to be broadened. And then I suggested, a number of ideas, whether that relates to both more significant cultural landscapes, and I go through sort of speaking of cultural landscapes, and or thinking of it in terms of a mass and connectivity for landscapes that would have an even greater ecological impact. So I kind of talk through it through those lens and sort of end with this idea of moving beyond the scenic to, how these places actually impact both our environment, our daily lives, et cetera, which is what sort of brought me to the idea of living, because it's not only the living, like the actual, ecological piece, but living as in how it impacts our daily lives.
So this notion of the public realm is so powerful because, of course, both of you in your works make the claim that life really is better in the public realm than in the private realm. I mean, we have to have both, but you make the claim that we need that public realm as a place of friction, engagement, socialization, and so on. And you have, although you work together, slightly different responses to this, and I want to just explore them a little bit more. I'm going to come back to you in terms of the scenic landscape and talk about your specific proposals, which you make about how to update the historic district to a parks district. So let's return to that in a second. But just to turn it over to Vishaan, where do you see the public realm? Where does it take place for you?
So, separate from this book, I just wrote a book that I've been working on for 7 years and came out several months ago that is almost entirely on this topic, in the sense that, to me, if you think about the two, you can add a third, existential crises of our day: climate change, political division, technological advancement. That the public realm for me is the antidote to each of those things. We can't address climate change without having some sense of, it's a collective action problem, climate change, right? So you have to have some sense of public, right? And in terms of political division, it really worries me the extent to which we spend all of our time with people who agree with us. And to me, the public realm isn't just a nice place for someone to go have a sandwich. It's where you interact eyeball to eyeball with people of difference and celebrate that difference. People who look different than you, pray different than you, vote different than you. And that you can have that exchange in civilization that you can't have online, which is increasingly uncivilized, and we know is designed to separate us. So to me, the public realm is the exact opposite of social media.
So Vishaan, so just because there are some people that claim that the public realm is digital as well, but you strongly disagree with that.
No, I don't disagree with it. I'm not a Luddite. It's not that. It's just, look, if you look at the Arab Spring, social media was used to generate physical protests, right? So it's not that there isn't a connection between the two, but I think it is fundamental in the moment we live in right now to embrace the positive social friction that public realms generate. Case in point, the playground at Domino Park. I like to go there because you see the kids of a variety of different communities, right? An Orthodox Jewish community, African American community, Latino community, a hipster community, where those kids did not interact in physical space before that park was built. We spent a lot of time in that neighborhood. And now all of a sudden they're playing together on that playground. And I am naive enough to believe that, 20 years hence, 30 years hence, they're going to be adults that think about the Middle East differently because they interacted face to face, right? We need that in our lives. I think it's absolutely critical to the common cause of civilization. And so the public realm is not some nice to have thing. It's the bedrock of democracy.
You look at the street, and you have looked at the street in real depth. You've looked at the street in terms of its changes over time, and you've looked at the way that our regulation has impacted what can and cannot be done in the street, vehicular traffic, wheelchairs. Can you talk a little bit more about what your research has unearthed about the public realm that we are all very familiar with, which is the sidewalk, the street, the stoop?
Well, so I worked in Bloomberg season 1, and we had this wonderful guerrilla transportation commissioner, Jeanette Sadikan, and one of the things she taught me was that the Department of Transportation can take over a street bed. It's got police powers to do so, and so Times Square, the way Times Square happened is a two-step. She temporarily closed Broadway going through Times Square, and then over time it became a permanent change, right? If I were in City Hall right now, while traffic is low because of congestion pricing in Manhattan, I would retake as much road bed for public space, for homeless services, for solid waste management, for a gazillion things we need that space for, that actually is now being less used by private automobiles. And so I think that, again, that ability to create more public realm is something that especially city transportation, we have a bridge under construction in Indianapolis, and I spent all this time with Indianapolis DOT trying to get it to be a one lane in each direction bridge so we get more space for the public. It's a constant battle in a very car-driven society, including a very car-driven city. Let's not kid ourselves, right? And so reclaiming streets, I think, is one of the great projects of the 21st century, which I learned from others, but...
Well, and again, I say this in my piece too, but it's like we always think that we're coming up with something new, but that was, going back to the sort of history of the trail and the street and going back to the indigenous walks and trails. They were actually described and seen as trails and places. And we sort of lost the place somewhere in that background. And now they're sort of being, put back into this idea of, oh, it's also a place. It's not just from point A to point B.
As you were speaking, it occurred to me the obvious thing that you said, let's reclaim as much of that transportation bed for public space as we could to make the street a better public realm. The High Line is a reclaiming of a transportation bed for public space. Would you extend the principles and the ideas of the High Line to the rest of the city streets? I'm trying to dig a little deeper into your idea about
I don't think you want to pedestrian. I'm all for pedestrianizing, but I don't think you want to fully pedestrianize the city of New York. Obviously, it wouldn't work for a gazillion practical reasons, but also, the city needs a certain vibrance that is important that comes from the mix of modes. And so it's not about getting rid of all vehicles. It's about taming the vehicle and not giving over to the vehicle more space than it needs. I think it's about a balance. At least that's...
And there's also this notion of, I don't know, maybe there are streets for different types of things. It's like every street doesn't have to fix every problem, right? And so it kind of helps you think about, okay, this street actually makes a really strong connection between, a series of park systems. Maybe that should be seen more as a greenway. Another street maybe, does something else. And so it's not to say that you should have separate also silos of streets, but I think that it's sort of thinking strategically about how they function, what they're connecting, what they can do and why. Yeah, I know it's hard. Part of the High Line's magic is that it's other, right? And it's that idea of being able to cross over the sort of bustle and, uninterrupted walking for 1.5 miles without the cadence of stopping so you still need that kind of, there are so many multiple ways to be in the city and you want to have that variety. But I think we're just saying that there was a moment where so much space was dedicated to the car, and hopefully we're in an age where we're thinking about how to recalibrate that.
So let's return a little bit to the Landmarks Law, because of course we like to think about what it needs and so on, but let's talk a little bit about what it got right. The downtown Wall Street area the street pattern is a landmark. It's designated. You can make changes to it, but it is landmarked. Many of the places that you invoke, Vishaan, when you talk about the street, you often invoke wonderful places, Jaipur, Venice, places that have really difficult streets to navigate, but they're landmarked, and they have been preserved in ways that if they weren't, all the character defining features, all the things that make them amazing, the quality of the place would be lost. So I'm trying to, would you see a place for the current landmarks law to save some of the character defining features of New York that you associated with, you began our conversation by saying, let's save the spirit of this city of change. Could there be a place for the landmarks law in saving some, if you had to pick a place or you pick a street or a methodology, how would you approach that?
So it's a complicated question. I mean, look, in terms of what you're saying about Venice and Jaipur, something that cracks me up. I tend to lecture in other parts of the country, and the vast majority of the country lives in sprawl, and then spends an extraordinary amount of money going to see the Spanish Steps. Think about it, right? Like it's mind-bending the way in which people have decided to live versus where they want to go on vacation, which are the places that are car light, car free, built before the car changed the scale of our cities. And whether that's, Tokyo or Europe, it's not a Western thing. It's a scale thing that happened post car. So that's one thing. But in terms of the landmarks law, Jorge, I mean, look, so I've been very involved in trying to fix Penn Station for the better part of 25 years. And of course, the landmarks law springs from the destruction of the original Penn Station, as I'm sure most of you know. Where is it useful? Where could it use change? I was very involved in Moynihan, the Farley Building, the Amtrak station across the street, which is a national landmark. So it's adjudicated not just by our local landmarks, but also by the feds through the State Historic Preservation Office, which tends to have, I think, more rigid standards than our Landmarks Commission. Our Landmarks Commission, I think, has, since the Hearst building and other things, really evolved more into this palimpsest mode. I find that to be much less true at the state level. So, for example, the Farley building, which is where Moynihan Station is right now, is the only building I can find built in the 20th century that has a moat built around it. That's the Postal Service in all of its glory. And so you're trying to now turn that into a public train station. And so maybe you question the worth of the moat around the building. That maybe a better sidewalk system, something that is more porous as a train station to the streets around it. But nope, you got to keep every tablespoon of the moat, right? And that inability to be interpretive, right? Now, maybe that's changed with SHPO since then. That was a conversation that took place almost 20 years ago now. But those are the kinds of things that I think should not be frozen in amber, where we have to have some dialogue around our historic buildings, right? I'm dealing with a tax credit project in Philadelphia right now, where again, the building wants to be more porous to the city and needs some level of change in order to be the beautiful, full thing it wants to be. And having that conversation can sometimes be really difficult. So I wish more things were like our Landmarks Commission, our Landmarks Law.
Well, that's interesting because you're pointing to some of the wisdom in the landmarks law to have a commission where you can have that dialogue, whereas the federal level really functions all at the staff level applying the law. There is no real,
And the staff level will often tell you, I would love to change that, but I can't. It's not that they're bad people in any way. They're hidebound by the law as opposed to having a commission which has more latitude.
Lisa, I want to return to some of the ideas that you presented, which I think are very interesting. I'm tempted to ask for your opinion on the BQE, which you mention in your essay, since we're talking about transportation. So maybe let's just take a little moment to hear your thoughts on the future of the BQE from landscape perspective?
Well, I mean, I talked about it in the essay more as this idea about, so many of you guys know, and have probably, if you've been on the BQE as both a driver or if you've been next to it as a pedestrian, it's like one of the worst places to be, right? But right above it, you do have the sort of promenade, and you have the Brooklyn Bridge Park and, other components specifically in that area. And there was a proposal to think about, because it had to be repaired in many places, to use that money and basically create some kind of a cap to go over the BQE and create more of a connection from the sort of upper level down to Brooklyn Bridge Park. But I think what I was sort of starting to think about is there was a number of community sort of alternative plans. There was a whole process in terms of what the Department of Transportation was putting forward, et cetera, et cetera. And it was, I mean, like, obviously, my personal take is to do something that would have greater benefit for, you could still do what you have to do in terms of getting from place to place, but would also create more amenity benefit, et cetera, for people. I don't know if I loved, the exact proposal and how it was done, but I think the spirit behind it was sort of, something that was, again, sort of taking something that was seen as a barrier and trying to create a connection, which, is happening, and I mentioned this too, but it's happening all over the world in terms of thinking about how most of our infrastructure bisected communities purposefully, and so rethinking how they can actually shift from being a barrier or something that sort of separates into something that is more connective.
So let's think about that idea of reconnecting, of repairing the city a little bit more, because in your specific proposal to the Landmarks Commission, if I was a commissioner reading your thing, you say, well, the unit of analysis of the city has changed. This is what I mean. You don't say it in these words, but I'm reading into it. We designated buildings and neighborhoods, essentially districts, right? Historic districts are kind of understood as social units of the city, coming from Abercrombie's famous plan of London, and so that's the social unit. It's the family unit is the building, the social unit is the community, and so we designate those. We're trying to protect the people as well as through the buildings. But you're saying, wait a minute, that's no longer the way that we should be thinking about cities. We need to have a more systemic thinking about the city. What is the unit of analysis for you?
Yeah, and I'm not saying that those units aren't valid. It's more of another layer, I would say, that perhaps is in addition to those, or maybe replaces those. But it was this idea, I mean, even now we're looking at all of these little separate coastal resiliency projects around Lower Manhattan and Brooklyn and Upper Hudson and everything. I mean, all of these, if you're looking at the scale of the watershed or you're looking at other things, they don't have the same disciplinary boundaries that all of these things follow. There's significant gaps between them. And if you're going to create a resiliency sort of flood strategy and you have one vulnerable place, the whole thing fails. And so it was this notion of like, if you are going to start thinking about, more holistic approaches to how we think about our coastline, to how we think about our natural systems, to how we think about our park systems, we could be more proactive in sort of highlighting where those key connections could and should be and protect them.
You call that a park district,
I used an example of I called it the sort of idea of the living landmarks, right? But whatever the name is, it sort of it doesn't really matter. But it was the idea of protecting a larger system versus individual units.
So we should be thinking about the unit as the ecology, the ecosystem of the city somehow should be our thinking.
I mean, this was the idea, is that ultimately if we're thinking about the repair and the care of the city, then that should be if not a primary layer, which I believe it should be, at least a layer.
Right.
It's not even a layer right now.
Interesting. We have time for some questions from you. If you'd like to raise your hand, there is a microphone, I believe, that can be moved around. And so I want to turn it over to, there's a question here right in the middle. Well, the microphone has another thought. So we'll come back to you. We'll come back to you.
I'm so sorry. Hi, thank you all so much for the conversation. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit more about like views and vistas and the preservation of those. One I'm thinking about in particular is the new, what I believe is a luxury condo building that they've put up that blocks the view of the Empire State Building from Avenue and from Madison Square Park. And I'm curious if you all know anything particularly about how it was allowed under the law and just thoughts on views and vistas in the city and more largely.
I mean, as far as I know, views are not regulated in any way, shape, or form. I would be
scenic views.
well, scenic. I mean, I'd be deeply skeptical. In part because, I mean, what really makes me laugh about this is the Empire State Building itself. I mean, for those of you who are fearful about super tall private buildings, go look at the early pictures of the Empire State Building when it was built. It was not only a super tall, it was a super fat. Its girth was extraordinary relative to everything around it, as was its height. Now, it's one of my favorite buildings in New York City, don't get me wrong. But my point is, this is a very strange place to live if we don't like skyscrapers. It's a very strange place to choose to live. You know, it just, this is part of who we are, and there will continually be new generations. And I wish that especially the better proportioned ones weren't all luxury condos for sure. But, you know, this is just at the heart of what New York is, it seems to me. And I think it's very, very hard to say we're going to freeze it at this point.
I mean, what's interesting is I think some of the projects and the work that has happened to open up for, in particular, our waterfronts. I mean, when I moved to New York City 30 years ago, you know, there was no even sense of getting to the waterfront. And in many ways, like the fact that you can now, as the public, access the waterfront and have some of these views from other places. It's not about the view from your particular room looking out, but the sort of larger, you know, public vista or views are actually being created today.
They won't be blocked. That's, I think, why they're so popular, right? Because you won't get another skyscraper in front of you. There are other questions here. There was one in the middle. Did you not want to have? Oh, you do. Okay.
Yeah, it's actually the same question.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
She beat me to it. But I was thinking of another view, which is that of the Brooklyn Bridge from the waterfront here in Brooklyn Heights, with that big black tower that's blocking it. And I was just thinking, you know, is that...
The big black tower in downtown Brooklyn?
Sorry?
The tower in downtown Brooklyn?
No, it's in Manhattan. But if you stand on the waterfront here in Brooklyn Heights, on the promenade, for example, the view you used to have for years and years of the Brooklyn Bridge, or the two bridges, now has this enormous black tower in the middle of it. And should that be landmarked, or, you know, should views of the Statue of Liberty should be landmarked? I mean, sure, I understand.
You know, can I just, I mean, I know the tower you're talking about, and it's really quite awful. But I think the problem there, so there's two things. One is these things, we have to remember something. So for example, when we were doing Domino, and, you know, neither of us designed the taller towers associated with Domino, but taller towers were part of the master plan. And one of the things the community said is, please, oh please, don't let them look like the towers to the north in Greenpoint, Williamsburg. And like, we have to ask ourselves, why is all this density pushed to the water's edge where there's not that much transportation? Well, it's because the neighborhoods near the transportation don't want density. You go to the Bedford L stop, the Bedford Ave L stop, and the housing is nowhere near as dense or tall as it is on the waterfront right? 5 blocks away, where there's much less transit and much more flood risk. Well, of course we're going to get a bunch of waterfront towers if neighborhoods don't want density in their neighborhoods, right? Because we're not, look, I just think it's really important to say this. I'm say this very straightforwardly in front of a crowd that probably loves preservation. We have a national party today that says that the country is full. We cannot have the opposite party saying the city is full. So people have to go somewhere, right? And the best places, we did a whole New York Times analysis around it. You don't have to demolish historic districts. There's plenty of land near our subway stations, outside of flood zones, where we can build middle-class housing that neighborhoods do not allow it to be built. And the more that's true, the more it's going to put pressure on our waterfronts, the more it's going to put pressure on our historic districts, and the really high-value areas where very big developers can afford to pay for the lawyers and lobbyists they need to build towers in those places. So that's happening in large measure because we are resisting housing where it belongs.
Here's another question. Okay, there's a question here in the front. Or did you already give the? That's fine. If you okay, so you go ahead and ask your question. Then there's one here, and the lady over here in the back has another question, and then we'll turn to you. I'm not sure we'll have time for everybody, but we'll try.
Okay, wonderful. I came in a little late, so I'm sorry if this was previously discussed. But I've heard a lot about landmark protections and things like that. But I've lived in Flatbush for 2 years. I've already seen a lot of people priced out of the area, a lot of gentrification happening quite rapidly across all of Brooklyn. So I'm wondering what sort of consideration was given to community cohesion, sustainability, and protecting that type of thing. I know a lot of the apartments around Domino are very expensive now. So yeah, I was just wondering what kind of discourse was about that type of thing.
I mean, Domino's about 30% affordable. I mean, at this point, there are parts of the Upper East Side of Manhattan that are cheaper than a lot of the hip neighborhoods in Brooklyn. And so, I think everyone also has to make the right individual decisions about where they choose to live, right, in terms of your own kind of participation in gentrification.
The waterfront question is, I'm not going there, but it's enormous. Lisa especially, but to anyone. Is the Elizabeth Street Garden a cultural landscape? And in any case, who educates that? How does that work in the middle of Soho?
Currently, or are you asking that as a hypothetical question?
Well, it's not hypothetical, really, because it's very threatened.
Yeah.
Momentarily, any minute. I personally think it's not just valuable, but priceless. It doesn't make money. It serves the community. It's in a,
I mean, at least in the way that I was thinking about it for the purposes of this effort and this essay, was trying to argue for the value of cultural landscapes. And I defined what that meant, both by the Landscape Cultural Foundation, UNESCO, et cetera, and criteria that have been established for how you actually think about cultural landscapes, and argued that there is a place for cultural landscapes in New York, under those types of criteria. But I think the difficult thing about cultural landscapes and how they're defined is that, and this is why I was sort of going to those sites to see how they defined it and how they were thinking about it, is that a lot of it tends to feel less, what's the right word? It's like it feels, subjective. It's like your perspective on something, or I use it for this. But that's why I thought looking to those sites to understand how the criteria have been developed. And sometimes it's actually about a spiritual connection to place. I mean, it's very vague, right? Other times it's about something else. And so I was arguing that I do think that those types of places, cultural landscapes in particular, have value and should be considered and thought about as part of the criteria for landmarks law. But again, the same way that every site is sort of interpreted and brought to the Landmarks Commission in different ways, like there would have to be a proving of its cultural significance.
There was a question, the gentleman in the back over here. We have
Should I?
time, I think, for... Oh,
I was-
please. Yeah. Oh,
Hi.
yes. I'm
Hi.
sorry.
Yeah,
yes.
yeah,
This one, and
no
then I think
problem.
we have time for you. Yeah.
This is a policy question, and it's sort of like, what would you do? Because you brought up the federal and the state law, historic preservation laws. And it's reminded me, like 40 years ago, I'm giving my age away, I worked on the state historic preservation law. And at the time, there was a reason, right? Because buildings were being knocked down, same as the Clean Water and Air Act. So there was a reason 40 years ago. Over the years, it's become like, as you said, sclerotic. And I was brought back to DOT, New York City DOT, to help with historic preservation, and I was appalled at how long it took to do anything. It's something that had been like 3 months, were taking years. So there are two questions. What would you do? How would you do it? And I think we also have to understand that sometimes it's the implementation. So these things happen. So anyway, I wanted you to respond to that if you would. I really would appreciate it.
I'll try. I mean, thank you for the question. I really appreciate your introspection about what happened over those 40 years, because I think it's really important. If any of you are feeling like lost in the left, like I am right now, I mean, I think there's a really interesting drumbeat going on in the country. Ezra Klein's new book about abundance, Mark Dunkelman's book about why nothing works, the stuff Congressman Jake Auchincloss has been talking about from Massachusetts. I would really encourage everyone to read that stuff and listen to that stuff, the podcast and so forth. The Ezra Klein book on abundance, so Jorge was asking me earlier about like a deregulation stance that I supposedly have. I don't. No. I mean, look, first of all, this has been going on since Reagan. Like this dismantlement of the government is not some new thing where like establishment Republicans are shocked there's gambling going on. And like, this has been going on for a long time. That is not the same thing as an on-the-ground analysis of understanding that our regulatory system is keeping the housing built, keeping us from building the housing we need, keeping us from getting the clean energy we need, keeping us from creating the coastal resilience we need. That's not falling into some neoliberal trap about deregulation. So if you're a party that believes in government, you have to believe that regulatory systems aren't there to just prevent bad things from happening, but are there to let good things happen and happen rather quickly. We have an all-affordable housing project in East New York that I think we had community acceptance on in the first year of going out to community. It's going to be 9 years between project conception and when that first family gets into a housing project. That's a problem that Donald Trump did not create. That's a problem we created, because what we wanted to do is create enough rules that power structures couldn't do bad things or things we thought were bad things, and instead we've created this crisis. And if we're going to respond and be effective, I'm going to be presumptuous in the use of the word we, but we've got to show people we can do things. We can't just have ribbon cuttings about Penn Station. We have to show we can do things, build things. President Biden passed a huge infrastructure law. Barely any of the car chargers got built. Barely any of the, Barack Obama tried to build high-speed rail. He couldn't do it because of the regulatory systems in blue states. If we are not honest with ourselves about this, we are going to lose more and more voters. And so the things that were really important 40 years ago, I totally agree were really important, but we've got to take another look at the Environmental Protection Act and whether it makes sense anymore or can be streamlined in some ways. It's fundamental, or we're just going to lose the whole ball game because we're going to prove ourselves to be completely ineffective.
Okay. I think we have time for this one last question.
I appreciate it. Thank you. I had a question for the group, how you position this conversation in terms of an agenda for sustainability. I think sustainability is something that architects struggle with as more than just an engineering agenda. Electrified buildings are important, heat pumps are important, but they don't necessarily make architecturally compelling buildings, whereas assuming that you believe in the truism that the most sustainable building is the one that's already built, which I do as someone that pays attention to embodied carbon, there's a lot of kind of conceptual juice in the practice of adaptive reuse and historic preservation. You were talking about fancy intellectual words like palimpsest and seams and nesting. These are very complicated conceptual words, but they make spaces very rich. They make a space a place. So I guess I wanted to ask the group, how do we position thinking about landmarks less about restorative nostalgia and more about being in service of a sustainability agenda and kind of a projective idea of how can we use the cultural assets around us productively?
You do?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question. I appreciate it. And I think that is in many ways part of the charge that we were all looking at in our own way of thinking about, well, if the New York City Landmarks Law was sort of built in a defensive and reactionary way, if we were now thinking about it as a more proactive and sort of encompassing the values of the city, not only that we are, but that we want to be, how would that sort of change the commission or the law, or completely maybe even get rid of the commission? I don't know. I mean, this was sort of the proposition. And so I think that, in my case, I was trying to look at it as a way of thinking about our natural and cultural heritage as being part of that conversation. And of course, like, site is a huge part of sustainability that I think people almost forget. They think it's like solar panels on buildings and green roofs, and it's like, okay, yes, but you're actually destroying the river system by putting that building there, or this, that, or the other. So I think, actually understanding and thinking about, site and what that means is also a big, component and piece of that. And then I do think that, what we're trying to argue for, I think, collectively, is this idea that there is value in the past, there is value in change and the optimism and sort of rethinking and reimagining things. And with every generation, we have new challenges to do that. And so sustainability has to be part of that. I mean, thinking about materials and systems, whether they're building systems or natural systems or whatever, I think it has to be integrated into that.
Well, I'm afraid we've reached the end of our program, and I just want to thank Lisa and Vishaan for the incredible talk. Thank you. The book is in the front. Thank you all for coming, and have a great night.